Hi, I'm Carolyn Atua, and this is the history of ... a podcast that uncovers the history we don't often hear about. Last episode, we began the story of Shirley Chisholm. We talked about her childhood, the teacher that inspired her to go into politics, the beginning of her political career, running for Congress, and what she did in her first term in Congress. If you are new to the show, welcome. We are very excited that you are listening to the history of ... But I recommend that you go back and listen to the first episode and then come back and listen to this one. So, let's waste no time and start the show. "1968 was known as one of the most violent years in American history, according to some historians. However, I could also argue that the early 1970s were also years filled with extreme violence and chaos in America and in Vietnam. Let's start with the Vietnam War. Last episode, we talked about Nixon's strategy, Vietnamization, how he wanted to decrease numbers of American troops by basically handing the war to South Vietnam. But in 1970, Nixon stretched the war even further by basically invading other countries near Vietnam.
The situation in Cambodia,
Historian Michael Flem,
was that the communist guerrillas, the Viet Cong in the south, as well as the North Vietnamese army, were using Cambodian base camps or sanctuaries. What would happen is that the communist guerrillas or the North Vietnamese army would attack U.S. forces, and then they would retreat across the border into Cambodia, and they would rest, and they would regroup, and they would resupply in Cambodia, and then when they were ready, they would attack the U.S. forces again. And so the Nixon administration became determined to get at the communists in Cambodia, and so the Nixon administration begins a secret bombing campaign against Cambodia in an effort to get at those communist bases or sanctuaries within Cambodia. And then, of course, as you probably know, eventually in 1970, the Nixon administration will order a full-out invasion.
Due to the invasion of Cambodia and Laos, university students were angry. They thought Nixon truly was going to end the war because that's what he said he was going to do. But he didn't. He made it even worse, and it angered students. Across the country, universities erupted in protests. But there was one university protest that remained memorable, and not in a good way. Kent State University.
The soldiers at Kent State, the National Guardsmen, and I don't know in Canada if you have something like the National Guard. These are not professional soldiers. These are what we might call weekend warriors. Instead of serving in the U.S. military, they agreed to give up, one weekend a month to train with the National Guard in case they're needed. And in return, they avoid service in the military and they don't get sent overseas. And so it's the National Guard is not as well trained. It's not as professional as the U.S. Army. The officers are not at the same level. What seems to have happened is that some of the protesters may have yelled vile things. Some of them may have thrown, bricks or rocks. And one of the National Guardsmen may have lost his cool or panicked and fired. And at that point, other soldiers around him thought that an officer had given the order to shoot.
I saw a man with a sidearm draw it from his holster, aim it into the crowd, and fire. At the same time, simultaneous with, and no pause between this, the rest of the guardsmen also fired. I saw some guardsmen who fired directly into the crowd. I saw guardsmen who were obviously firing over the heads of students. And I could see guardsmen who obviously, because of the position of their rifles, did not fire at all. Then students, immediately when the guard had turned, the students stopped, and when the first shot was fired, or shots, they turned and ran. The firing lasted perhaps 10 seconds or so. And during this time, I heard no order given to fire or to cease firing.
And what you get are 67 shots fired in 13 seconds, all from the National Guard, and 4 students at Kent State are dead.
Did the Kent State massacre erupted other universities to protest?
Yes, yes, you had millions of students on college campuses across the United States going on strike, protesting and demonstrating. At my university, Ohio Wesleyan University, in May 1970, classes came to a halt, exams came to a halt. The university effectively shut down for the rest of the semester after Kent State. So yes, there was a wave of activism across the United States following the tragedy at Kent State.
The massacre in Kent State and the protests that followed led to a realization that these protests are not doing anything to end the war, and men are still being drafted to go to war, and now students were being killed for protesting. So students started forming guerrilla groups. Their motive was to give the U.S. government a taste of their own medicine. And the most famous guerrilla group that came out of the anti-war movement was the Weathermen.
Hello. I'm going to read a declaration of a state of war. This is the first communication from the Weathermen Underground. Within the next 14 days, we will attack a symbol or institution of American injustice.
This is a clip from the film The Weathermen Underground. The Weathermen was formed in 1969 and was a group of university students who were members of SDS, Students for a Democratic Society. And as the war continued, they decided to form this group. This group wanted to create a revolution to overthrow the U.S. government. So they set explosions in various government buildings. 3 people died from one of the explosions. However, those 3 people were actually members of the Weathermen, and they were working on a bomb, and the bomb accidentally ignited and killed them. And this led the Weathermen to go underground, henceforth why the group was also called the Weathermen Underground.
The FBI said the Weather Underground organization, which took credit for the bombing, is the same radical group which was responsible for the bombing of the U.S. Capitol in 1971 and the Pentagon in 1972. But federal officials don't really know much about the group, which is believed to have between 20 and 30 members.
I'm a teacher now in a community college, and my students will occasionally bring up the war in Vietnam and ask me what my involvement was. And I'll say, well, I helped found an organization whose goal was the violent overthrow of the government of the United States. And my students would look at me as if I'm from another planet.
It seemed to me that we were entering an incredible period of revolution, and I didn't want to miss that. I wanted to be part of it.
Toward the end of 1968, I had really decided that I was committed to being a part of what I thought was going to be a really serious and ongoing rebellion, upheaval that had the potential of not just ending the war, but of really overthrowing the capitalist system and put in its place something much more humane.
Aside from the Vietnam War, there was another war that was beginning to happen, the war on drugs.
Nixon launches a war on drugs for a couple of reasons. One is that it's politically popular, especially with his base of white conservatives. Nixon also believes that many within those social movements you described are themselves drug users, whether it's casual marijuana use or something more serious. And so waging a war on drugs is another way to indirectly attack those social movements that he sees as so damaging and destructive. So there's sort of both a political benefit, but there's also a benefit of attacking those social movements as well.
I could picture Shirley Chisholm being in her office, the TV blasting with coverage on the continuation of the war, an explosion that the Weathermen Underground took credit for, the Kent State Massacre, and Nixon announcing the war on drugs, and started forming this idea in her head. To be clear, all this didn't happen in real life. Well, there's no record of it happening. However, these events that we just spoke of led her to make a major decision. So it's 1972, and the presidential primary elections already started.
About 7 months ago, a large number of persons in this country, crossing sex lines, color lines, and ideological lines, asked me to consider seriously making a bid for the presidency of the United States of America. And in the very beginning, to be frank with you, I laughed. And I indicated to many of these people that if indeed they were serious, it was very necessary for them to go back and do at least two things to make me feel that it was not really just a little game, or it was not really a plan to flatter my vanity. And that was that they had to go back and to start to raise monies for me to enter some of the primaries, supplemented by putting together mechanisms for the distribution of literature and for carrying my message to the people in this country. And I found that within 5 weeks' time, in 25 states of this country, that people were serious about Shirley Chisholm making a bid for the presidency.
So Shirley Chisholm went to New York and announced her run for president.
I stand before you today as a candidate for the Democratic nomination for the presidency of the United States of America.
Yep, she was running for president. This was huge and historic. She was the first black woman to run for president. She was the first black American to ever run for president. This was before Jesse Jackson ran for president in the 1980s. This was before Barack Obama won the presidency twice and became the first black president. And this was before Hillary Clinton became the first female presidential nominee for any major party. This was huge, but remember the era that she was announcing her presidency in. This was a time where there were still so many rights that women didn't have. And the Voting Rights Act was just passed 8 years before she ran for president. White politicians and white journalists commented on her gender. And bear with me here because these comments get really sexist. Former Vice President and presidential candidate Herbert Humphrey's own physician Edgar Berman said, "Women can never become an effective president because of their periods, basically." He also said, suppose a menopausal woman president who had to make a decision of the Bay of Pigs. Journalist Louis Martin accused Chisholm for playing vaginal politics to piggybacking the women's rights movement. Journalist Andrew Tully said, "We are feared doomed to an era of female meddling in the electoral process. Chisholm doesn't have a chance at the top banana, of course." A piece at the Oakland Post described her physical appearance, saying, "Mrs. Chisholm speaks with an engaging lisp in a diminutive and short knee-high lace-up boots." Black politicians also weren't happy with Chisholm's candidacy for president. They always wanted a black person to run for president, but they wanted that black person to be a man, to be the first ever black American to ever run for president. So when Chisholm announced her bid for the presidency, they couldn't believe it because she was a woman and they didn't want a black woman to be the first black American to run for president. So after she announced her run for president, thousands of local and prominent black leaders went to Gary, Indiana for the first National Black Convention.
Well, the Gary Convention was called to create a
historian Barbara Winslow.
Black agenda and to raise the idea of a black person running for president. Chisholm did not attend because she knew she wasn't going to be welcome there, and she wouldn't have been. And she'd already announced she was going to run for president, so they all knew that. And it was run by the former Leroy Jones and Mary Baraka, and it was extraordinarily masculinist, male chauvinist. And there was one woman, I think she was the first African-American elected official from Oklahoma, who stepped down from the planning committee because of the way women were talked about and treated.
I went to the Gary, Indiana Black Political Convention.
This is Congresswoman Barbara Lee. And this clip is from the film Contender 16 for 16 by PBS.
And we tried to get an endorsement from the Black Political Convention delegates for Shirley Chisholm for president. We couldn't even get it there. I mean, the guys had it sold up.
The convention voted not to support her.
But you see, the black politicians are no different from the white politicians. They've made their deals, they've made their contracts, because they didn't believe that Mrs. Chisholm knows how to maneuver or what have you.
These comments have followed Chisholm throughout her political career. When she ran for state legislator, men would say, "How dare she? She's a woman." When she ran for Congress, her opponent, James Farmer, during the general elections, constantly commented on her gender. And now, when she's running for president, the cycle of sexist comments continues. And it has always bothered Chisholm. There was one clip that I found that really emphasized her anger on men especially, that look at her and just see a woman and not a capable person. She was at the UCLA campus and she was speaking to a bunch of university students.
For over 15 years of my life, I have been writing projects and all kinds of proposals for gentlemen, both black and white. For over 15 years of my life in politics in the streets of New York, I have been the translator and interpreter as they would go around addressing the people because they could only speak English if they could handle that well. For over 15 years of my life, I have been the organizer of peoples to make them look good at city council hearings and budget estimate hearings. I'm a woman that holds 3 college degrees and 10 points from a PhD. I'm not here to boast to you, but I'm just a little bit sick and tired of people not looking at me in terms of my humanity and my capabilities.
So the first stop on the campaign trail, Florida, the Sunshine State. She went around the state, stopping at every county, city, and town located in Florida. In Marin County, before Chisholm gave her speech at the courthouse square, she stood at the middle of the square and stared at the Confederate statue, and remembered in 1934 a lynching that took place on the same courthouse square that she was standing in the middle of. When she gave her speech, she talked about the feeling she felt being on the courthouse square. A feeling came over me about the courthouse, a place of fear for blacks for 100 years, where white justice had been dealt out of them. I never thought I'd live to see a black person speaking from the courthouse steps. When she was on the campaign trail, she campaigned for ending the Vietnam War, expanding public schools, rebuilding cities, universal daycare, promised not to give foreign aid to undemocratic nations, and also opposed the No-Knock Law, which was a law that allowed law enforcement to smash into citizens' doorsteps without a warrant, and law enforcement could arrest a citizen if they suspected them of selling or using drugs. The night before the Florida primary, journalists predicted the outcome of the Florida primary and predicted Chisholm was not going to win. One reporter wrote, U.S. Representative Shirley Chisholm of New York is a woman and she's black, and she doesn't stand a chance of winning the Democratic presidential primary in Florida next Tuesday.
Oh, I think it's quite well known that I don't enter most things with the blessings of any party. I think it's quite well known. Anybody who's followed my political career knows very, very keenly that I am the only unbought and unbossed politician. And I mean that literally. And I think that you have to recognize that because I am not white and because I'm not a male, that I am not going to get the blessings of the power structure in this country. So I think we're fooling ourselves when that question is asked of me in terms of whether I'm going to get their blessings. Of course I'm not going to get their blessings.
This was an archival footage of Chisholm on the campaign trail in Florida. She did lose the Florida primary. After losing the Florida primary for the next 6 months, Chisholm went around the country. She traveled from state to state, county to county, town to town, and city to city. Who supported Chisholm's run for president?
She had support from the Black Panther Party. She had support from Rosa Parks. She had support from the California National Organization for Women. She had support from Gloria Steinem. She had support from Dolores Huerta of the Farm Workers Union. She had the support from radical white feminists. She had support from a number of gay organizations, women's liberation organizations. She had grassroots, as we would say, support?
I was in school in Iowa, and I was miserable. I was a closet case and incredibly unhappy. But I've always been political.
This is filmmaker Jim Hobart.
I started going to anti-Vietnam War demonstrations when I was 16. So I wanted to do something political, and then the caucuses, were, I don't know if they were literally absolutely new that year, but they were different that year.
Yeah.
The process changed in 1972, and so I had to go to the caucus. And the thing that people don't know or don't remember about what are called the Iowa caucuses is that what we concentrate on that night in February is just the beginning of the process. So the first thing is there's a caucus on the precinct level, and then you send delegates to the county level, and then at the county level delegates are elected to the to the state level, and actually the votes for the convention are actually decided at the state level. So I went to the precinct caucus, and it was in somebody's some nice people's house, and there were a bunch. I don't remember. There were 2, 3, maybe 4 dozen people, and we sat around and talked about politics, and at some point we split off into groups. And the reason I supported Shirley Chisholm is she was certainly the most left-wing person running for president at that point. And she was from New York. She was from Brooklyn. I was born in Brooklyn. Sort of felt connected to her in a way that I didn't feel connected to George McGovern, who was from South Dakota, or Eugene McCarthy, who was from Minnesota. She really represented a challenge to the status quo. So that's what attracted me to her politically. I think there were, there were a few other people in the precinct, and I think as I remember, I have this vague memory of being in these people's house and the caucus, and then there's another meeting, like in a gymnasium, and that must have been the county. I can't remember what happened, but I have this memory of standing, in a line, at the head of the line with a few people behind me supporting Shirley Chisholm.
As the primaries were coming to a close, Chisholm managed to secure one primary, New Jersey. She got 67% of the vote, and won 2 caucuses, Mississippi and Louisiana. I should have warned you before I played those sound effects that no one attempted to assassinate Chisholm. But someone did attempt to assassinate George Wallace, who was the governor of Alabama and was one of Chisholm's opponents. He was actually the frontrunner to take the Democratic presidential nominee's spot. Wallace was giving a speech in a shopping mall in Maryland. A gunman came towards Wallace and shot him on the chest. He fell to the ground. Wallace was immediately taken to the hospital, where he had surgery. He survived the surgery, but he was forever paralyzed from both legs. The attempted assassination on Wallace's life led Nixon to order extra security precautions to all the presidential candidates. When Wallace was still in the hospital recuperating, all the Democratic candidates visited Wallace at the hospital. Now, there is something you need to know about George Wallace. How did I put this? Well, he was a segregationist. A hardcore segregationist. I mean, this is what he said in his inaugural address when he was elected governor of Alabama.
And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
And this is where we come back to Shirley Chisholm. Chisholm was conflicted on visiting Wallace in the hospital. She was the only black candidate, and if she visited Wallace at the hospital, black Americans could be angry with her that she visited a man that considers African Americans second-class citizens. But at the same time, she thought, this was still a human being who almost died. So she made the decision to visit him in the hospital. When she entered his room, Wallace was shocked to see her. Out of all the candidates, Chisholm was the last person he would expect to visit him in the hospital. He even asked her, "What are your people going to say?" And she replied, "I know what they're going to say, but I wouldn't want what happened to you to happen to anyone else." He was really touched by that.
Wallace began to admire Chisholm because, one, he felt that she was the only candidate, even though he totally disagreed with everything she said. She was the only candidate who really did speak her mind, said what she believed. And all the rest were just very mealy-mouthed. So they ended up having a respectful friendship. And after he recovered, he worked with Southern politicians to help her pass some of her legislative ideas.
I'll give you one example of how Wallace helped Chisholm get some of her legislation passed. This happened after the presidential elections. Chisholm introduced a bill that would extend the federal minimum wage provision for domestic workers, and she really needed Southern Democrats' support on this bill. But she had a really hard time convincing them to support this bill, until she told her good friend George Wallace, who then called and met up with many Southern Democrats who all came around and supported her bill. Okay, let's get back to the campaign trail. Leading up to the Democratic National Convention, Chisholm, according to the New York Times, had a total of 32 delegates. Delegates include Betty Friedan, famous feminist and author of The Feminine Mystique; Evelyn Payne Davis, founder of the New York chapter of the National Coalition of 100 Black Women volunteer organization; Gloria Steinem; Florence Kennedy, a civil rights lawyer; Kathy Samuels, daughter of Howard J. Samuels, president of Off Track Betting Corporation; and Charlotte Jones, wife of Clarence Jones, publisher of Amsterdam News. However, we did mention white feminists like Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedan supporting her candidacy. Well, there are some reports that say that they supported her candidacy privately, but publicly they actually endorsed George McGovern for president. On July 10th to 13th, the National Democratic Convention took place. There were cheers and excitement. There was an increase of women, African Americans, and youth that attended the convention as delegates for the first time ever. Now, there were 8 Democratic candidates that wanted to secure the nomination for president: Herbert Humphreys, George McGovern, George Wallace, Edmund Muskie, Eugene McCarthy, Henry Jackson, Chisholm. Finally, another woman ran for president that same year, an Asian woman named Patsy Mink. After the attempted assassination on Wallace's life, he was no longer leading the presidential race, as we mentioned before, which led candidates McGovern and Humphreys to become leading contenders for the nomination. Now, here's how conventions work. If you are a presidential candidate in either party, your name is put down as a nominee, and delegates vote for you, and whoever has the most votes gets the nomination. When Chisholm arrived at the convention, she expected that her good friend Ron Dellum was a prominent congressman in Oakland and was a former Black Panther. Throughout Chisholm's run, he was one of the few black men that supported her run for president. He was the one that was supposed to put her name down as a candidate for the nomination. But that didn't work out.
She gets sold out by another man. Ron Dellums, at the last minute, is under tremendous pressure from Willie Brown, who's then the mayor of San Francisco, and he refuses at the very last minute to put her name into nomination, and she's completely crushed. Her name gets placed in nomination by Percy Sutton and Charles Evers. So Shirley Chisholm is the first woman to have her name put in nomination by the Democratic Convention.
Then the voting began. The first day of the convention, McGovern was the favorite to win because he already had enough delegates to secure the nomination. Muskie and Humphreys withdrew from the race, so there were only 5 candidates left. Eventually, McGovern secured his nomination with 1,864 votes. Chisholm only got 151 votes. Next day, they voted on the Democratic platform. There were many proposals that Democrats wanted their party to support. George Wallace proposed that the Democratic platform should support guns, school prayer, popular election of federal judges, senator confirmation toward justices, the death penalty, constitutional amendment to outlaw both busing and tax reform. These proposals were voted down. The National Welfare Rights Organization wanted to grant incomes of families of 4. Women's groups proposed to give women control of their reproductive lives without any interference. And gay groups proposed for gay rights. All these proposals were voted down. However, there were few proposals that were suggested that weren't voted down and became part of the Democratic platform of the 1972 presidential election. They were to support federal surplus land to give to Israel and Native Americans, as well as sought for peace, reduction in wasteful defense spending, military cuts, and redistribution of wealth. During the convention, Chisholm gave a speech. She wanted African American men to know that I did this because I had the courage to do it. I did this because I had the guts to do it. I did this because I was the only one who had the balls to do it. After McGovern secured the nomination, he faced Nixon in the general elections. He lost to Nixon. Nixon got 520 of the Electoral College vote, and McGovern only had 17. Then Watergate happened, Nixon resigned, and Gerald Ford became president. Now, Chisholm wasn't an idiot. She knew that she was not going to win the presidency. She knew that she was way ahead of her time. The mission wasn't to win the presidency, although if she did win the presidency, well, if she won the nomination first and then the presidency, she would have been really happy. The mission was to prove that anybody, a black woman, a black man, a white woman, an Asian man, has the right to run for president and being taken seriously as a candidate for president. In her second memoir that she wrote, called The Good Fight, where she chronicled her run for president, she said,
I ran for the presidency despite the hopeless odds to demonstrate the sheer will and refusal to accept the status quo. The next time a woman runs, or a black, or a Jew, or anyone from a group that the country is not ready to elect to its highest office, I believe that he or she will be taken seriously from the start. I ran because somebody had to do it first. In this country, everybody is supposed to be able to run for president, but that has never really been true.
In America, we still have a hard time believing that a person of color or a woman can run and win the presidency. When Obama won the presidency twice, he faced racist comments all the time. There was the whole birtherism controversy. There was one photo going around of all the presidents that America ever had. And the last photo, which was supposed to be a picture of Obama, was a black background that had big eyes and big lips. Hillary Clinton in the 2016 presidential elections faced extreme sexist comments. One voter said, I didn't want to vote for her because of her period. Another said it was because she was a woman. Another said it was because she was unlikable. And these comments weren't coming from just men. They were also coming from women. And then we all know what happened after the 2016 presidential elections. In Hillary Clinton's concession speech, she said, and I quote, "Now I know. We have still not shattered that highest and hardest glass ceiling, but someday someone will. Chisholm was the first Black woman to really put a crack on that glass ceiling that hovers around women and minorities. Not just when she ran for president, but when she also ran and won a seat in Congress. She opened the door to all the many women and minorities that would come after her, that became House Speaker, that became leading members of Congress, that led committees and hearings. And that crack has gotten a lot bigger over the years. And it got bigger in the 2018 midterm elections, when 100 women from very diverse backgrounds were elected to Congress for the first time in history. When Chisholm was first elected to Congress in 1969, there were only 10 women that were in Congress that same year. 10. Now there's more than 100. And maybe since there are 5 women that are running for president in the 2020 election, who knows? Maybe that is the year where we finally elect a female for president. In 1973, she comes back to Congress and resumes her duties as a representative in the 12th Congressional District. She continues to introduce more bills in the House, like introducing the Economic Opportunity Amendment, which allocates funds to the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964. She also introduced a bill to permit employees of the federal government to elect coverage under old age, survivors, and disability insurance system. In 1975, New York was hit with a major financial crisis. The state was close to bankruptcy. New York had $53 million in debt, and they really needed to pay it off. The clock was ticking for them to pay off their debt. The problem was, though, that no one was willing to help them pay off their debt. The federal government and the president didn't want to help. The banks didn't want to help either. Finally, what helped the city pay off their debts were the teachers' union that paid a large amount of the city's debt.
And to be very honest, she did a lot for her district. But as sort of the attack, the beginning of what we academics call neoliberalism, was the beginning of the attacks on the cities. There was a famous Daily News headline, Ford to city dropped dead when the city got bankrupt. Chisholm couldn't get as much pork for her constituents.
Chisholm, in 1976, ran and was elected to Congress. This would be her final term in Congress. In her last term, she left the Education Committee and accepted a seat in the Rules Committee, making her the first Black woman and the second woman to ever serve in that committee. The Rules Committee was in charge of determining which bills would come to the House floor. She also served in the Secretary of Democratic Caucus. In 1977, she helped create the Congressional Women's Caucus, which helped and supported women that entered public office. In 1978, she voted against increasing funding for the Antitrust Division in the Justice Department. She voted no for the National Gas Regulation Bill. President Jimmy Carter told the House Speaker and told him to make sure Chisholm votes yes. But knowing Chisholm, she didn't change her mind. Speaking of President Carter, he and Chisholm really didn't get along. One former staffer of Jimmy Carter, who often picked Chisholm from the White House, were told she would come back furious. And she wasn't mad because they hadn't pulled out her chair, but because they considered her invisible. In 1979, she sponsored a bill that would provide federal support, state, local, and community activities to prevent domestic violence and help victims of domestic violence. The bill passed in the House. She sponsored a bill to strengthen and improve Medicaid services to low-income children and pregnant women. That also passed in the House. She introduced a bill to protect farmers, which didn't pass, and she introduced a bill that would improve federal program assistance on mental health services, which did pass. As the decade of the 1970s were coming to a close, many of the turbulence started to fade away. The Vietnam War ended in 1973. The draft ended following the end of the Vietnam War, so there were no anti-war protests in universities. The Weathermen underground by the end of the 70s faded away. However, many groups of people were making sense of what happened in the 60s and early 70s. And there was a group of people that were observing what America had become in the 60s and 70s and felt like the country was diminishing its Christian roots.
Some of these examples would have been John Fia, and I'm professor of history at Messiah College. The decision to remove prayer from public schools, Christian prayer from public schools in 1962 in the Engel v. Vitale case, Supreme Court case. A year later, the Supreme Court removes mandatory Bible reading from public schools in a case called Abington v. Shemp. The country is becoming much more diverse. In 1965, Congress passes the Hart-Celler Act, or the Immigration Act of 1965, which opens up the doors in America for the first time to non-Western immigrants from the Middle East, from Asia, from Africa. This kind of brings great diversity to the country, and of course, many of these new immigrants are going to bring their religious faith with them. So then in 1973, you have Roe versus Wade. You have, throughout the early 70s, there's a Supreme Court case most people don't normally know about, Green v. Connolly, which requires white-only schools in the South to desegregate, or else they don't desegregate, they lose their tax-exempt status. So this is viewed as kind of the government, right, telling white Christians how they should live, how they should conduct their Christian schools, and how they should read their Bible. So all of these things, I like to think of it as a kind of perfect storm in the 60s and 70s. Change, progress, demographic change, cultural change. This brings a great deal of fear and anxiety to many conservative evangelical Christians.
All these issues led to the formation of the Christian rights movement, and the Christian rights movement formed multiple coalitions, the biggest one being the Moral Majority. But before we go into the Moral Majority, I want to talk about the Equal Rights Amendment. Both the Moral Majority and the Christian Right as a whole were against the Equal Rights Amendment. You remember the Equal Rights Amendment. We talked about it last episode. And I did mention that the amendment passed 3 years after Chisholm gave her speech and reintroduced the amendment. Well, it sort of passed. There is more to the story. It did pass in Congress and in the Senate, and even Nixon supported the amendment. But in order for an amendment to be a law, it needs to be ratified in 38 of the 50 states. Just as it was very close to being the law of the land, there was a woman who created a crusade against the Equal Rights Amendment. Phyllis Schlafly. Who was Phyllis Schlafly?
She was a conservative Catholic activist in Illinois.
This is Daniel Williams. He is a professor of history at the University of West Georgia.
She was an active leader in Republican Party circles, particularly Republican Party women's organizations, and she had always been more conservative than many Republicans. So in the 1960s, she had been a strong supporter of Barry Goldwater. In fact, had written a book in support of his campaign. And whereas some Republican women at the time were more centrist or even more liberal, people who were backing candidates like Richard Nixon or even Nelson Rockefeller. But she was on the right wing of the Republican Party. And she was especially concerned about communism. That was one of her main issues of concern in the late 60s and early 70s. But in 1972, she became concerned about the Equal Rights Amendment.
Why was she against the ERA?
She said that it would disrupt the home. So feminists who supported the Equal Rights Amendment thought that most of her charges were baseless. But what she said was that the ERA would, first of all, disrupt women's privacy by resulting in unisex public restrooms, which the supporters of the ERA did not. They said, that wouldn't happen. She said that it would result in women being drafted, which the supporters of the ERA did concede that would occur if there was a draft. They were hoping, since the draft had ended in 1973 with the end of the Vietnam War, they were hoping that it would never be reinstated because most of them just opposed to the draft in general for both men and women. But they did concede if there was a draft that, yes, women would be drafted. And Schlafly made a lot of that argument. So that was certainly very important to the opponents of the ERA to keep women from out of military combat, from being forced to serve in war. But beyond that,
she believed again that gender roles, John Fea roles, the differences, there were clear differences between men and women, her argument was. And that, women, it wasn't as if she was saying women are inferior to men, but she said that she would argue that women had different roles to play than men. And for a woman to stay at home, to raise children, to provide for the religious instruction of those children in the home, she would resist the idea to say that was a lesser role than men. So, than what men do in the public life.
Schlafly created the Stop ERA movement, where she worked with conservative women and other religious conservative leaders who protested the ending of the ERA. She was so successful because only 35 of the 38 states ratified the amendment, so it wasn't a law. Some historians say that she was one of the main reasons why that amendment failed. Schlafly and Jerry Falwell, who was the leader of the moral majority, were close, and he admired her. Now, Schlafly wasn't part of the moral majority, but she was part of the Christian rights movement. Jerry Falwell, he was a very controversial figure among the black community and among the gay community. He said a lot of really terrible things towards gay people during the AIDS crisis. The moral majority was formed in 1979, and it wasn't until a governor of California who announced his bid for president who made the moral majority and the Christian right very powerful.
I'm here tonight to announce my intention to seek the Republican nomination for President of the United States.
The moral majority and the Christian right were really attracted to Ronald Reagan. Why, you asked? Well,
he opposed abortion. He supported the idea of an anti-abortion constitutional amendment to reverse Roe v. Wade, and to even go further in essentially banning most abortion in the United States, unless it was necessary to protect a woman's life. He supported a school prayer amendment. He said he supported the right of private Christian schools to essentially operate without having to comply with the federal civil rights mandate and enroll a certain percentage of minority students. So on issue after issue, his positions actually lined up with theirs. And he did give rhetorical support to the moral majority and the Christian right. During the campaign of 1980, he spoke at Falwell's Liberty University, what was then called Liberty Baptist College, and he traveled to Lynchburg to do that. So he also spoke to other evangelical gatherings. And so there was there was a clear perception that there was a shared interest there.
In 1982, Shirley Chisholm announced that she would not be seeking re-election and is leaving Congress. Progressive activists that admired her in the 60s and 70s for taking a radical, strong turn for the rights of minorities were really sad that she was leaving in a time where the rights of minorities that she fought for were really suffering during the Reagan era. This was the era of the war on drugs, where poor African Americans and Latino men were constantly being arrested and sent to prison, serving lifetime sentences for drug possession or selling drugs. When crack cocaine hit the scene, African Americans' arrest rates skyrocketed. According to the U.S. Sentencing Commission, found 84.5% of blacks convicted on possession of crack cocaine in 1993. And according to the University of Chicago Legal Forum, in 1980, 22% of drug offenders were sentenced to federal prison. In 1988, that number increased to 39%, and 30 to 40% of those who were sentenced were black. This was the era of the fear that Roe v. Wade could be overturned. Reagan was pro-life, and the moral majority in the Christian right were against abortion and wished to dismantle abortion rights. And this is where you have the idea that in order to end Roe v. Wade, you need to add conservative judges in the lower courts and in the Supreme Court. During this time, abortion providers and clinics were being bombed at. According to the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, reported between May 29, 1982 to January 1, 1985, 30 bombings attacks happened in 30 different abortion clinics. Finally, this was the era of the AIDS crisis.
We knew something was wrong with him because he had a couple of lesions, but and they had found some lesions, I think, internally. But
some sort of a counseling. We went to the first clinic that was doing testing in Puerto Rico, and there I was, positive.
I still can see it, a shot from the back of two gay men walking down the Haight and like holding hands. That was the shot. What I came to it was this horror of seeing homophobia manifested when people were sick and dying.
In 1986, 12,000 Americans died from AIDS. In 1988, it increased to 20,000 Americans died from AIDS. And the federal government wasn't doing anything to help. So of course, people were upset that Shirley Chisholm, one of the most outspoken progressive voices in Congress, was leaving Congress in a time when they felt that they really needed her. But in a quote from the Washington Post, she said, "Broken, not at all. I am leaving somewhat saddened because I didn't realize how many people felt about me legislatively. People interpret because I am leaving at a time when I guess voices like mine are needed more than ever, that I have selected the wrong time to leave, never taking into account that I always have indicated that I do not want to spend my entire time in the political arena." Publicly, she said the reason why she is not seeking another term in Congress is because she wants to spend more time for herself and to take care of her second husband who got into a really bad car accident. There were rumors, though, that say otherwise. That say she left because she felt uncomfortable with Reagan and the Christian right. And I still can't help but think that those rumors may possibly be true. It's all because of a bill that passed while she was a state legislator in Albany. It was her second term in the legislature. A bill was passed regarding allocating funds to Christian schools. Chisholm voted against this bill. In her memoir, she mentioned that the American government needs to have a separation between church and state, which means that the American government needs to be secular. Fast forward to the 1980s, where the moral majority and the Christian right don't believe that the American government should be secular, and they are becoming a very powerful and influential group. Now, historians debate about how much influence the Christian right and the moral majority had on Reagan. They certainly became a very influential group among the Republican Party after Reagan, but they still debate about how much influence they had during Reagan's presidency. However, I am simply going to just state the facts here. When Reagan was a governor of California, he legalized abortion in California. This was in the end of the 1960s, but when he ran for president, he pledged to end abortion. When he became president, he cut funding for abortion clinics. Plus, he was silent when abortion clinics were being bombed at and abortion providers were being executed. Now, we don't know if he changed his mind by himself or if he got a nudge from the moral majority. Some historians say he was influenced by the moral majority on the issue of abortion. Others say he wasn't. The same goes to the AIDS crisis. Before he even entered politics, he was an actor who knew a lot of gay actors and was comfortable with them. But when the AIDS crisis was killing gay men, he was silent and even cut funding for AIDS research. Again, some historians say that the moral majority pressured Reagan not to say anything regarding the AIDS crisis, and some historians say otherwise. So for a progressive woman like Shirley Chisholm, who while she was running for president got the support of gay rights activists, who supported the rights to an abortion, and believed in secularism, would encounter a group of people that had influence and was against everything that she believed in. I can't help but think that the moral majority and the Christian right and Reagan had something to do with her leaving Congress. Again, I have no factual evidence, but it's just a theory. When I asked the question to Barbara Winslow, the historian that wrote Shirley Chisholm's biography, why she left Congress, this was her response.
Well, one, she didn't think she could do any more in Congress. She was devastated. Her husband had been in a horrific car accident, and she had to spend a lot of time between Brooklyn, Washington, and Buffalo, where her husband was recuperating, and that was exhausting her. And she would probably face a primary challenge, and she knew her role in history, and she knew she did not want to be defeated in a end her political career losing in a primary challenge. So I think those three factors contributed to her deciding not to run for political office.
After she left Congress, she co-founded the National Political Congress of Black Women. She campaigned for Jesse Jackson's presidential bid both in 1984 and in 1988. She taught at Mid-Holyoke College. Later on, she moved to Florida, and President Bill Clinton actually picked her to be the U.S. ambassador to Jamaica. However, due to health reasons, she declined his offer. On January 1st, 2005, the unbossed and unbought woman passed away in her home in Ormond Beach, Florida. I do not want to be remembered as the first Black woman to be elected to the United States Congress, even though I am. I do not want to be remembered as the first woman who happened to be Black to make a serious bid for the presidency. I'd like to be known as a catalyst for change. Thanks to all the historians that I spoke to, Barbara Winslow, Michael Flem, John Sia, and Daniel Williams. Thank you to filmmaker Jim Hobart for speaking with me. The archival footage that we used in this episode is from the May 4th collection, Kent State University Library's Special Collection and Archives. Director Sam Green for the Weatherman Underground documentary. NYC Municipal Archives, PBS, State Archives of Florida, Alabama Department of Archives and History, Ronald Reagan Library, and finally the ACT UP Oral History Project. This episode is produced, reported, and edited by me, Talanatua. If you enjoyed listening to these 2 episodes, please subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Spotify. Also, rate and review the podcast on iTunes. The more people rate and review the podcast, the more listeners we gain. If you don't have iTunes, spread the word. Tell everyone that you know about this podcast. You have been listening to The History of ... I'm Talanatua. Bye. Next time on The History of ... we enter into the world of art and literature and tell the story of an author that changed the narrative of working-class Black women.
History is the first one to give us a sense of what it's like for a woman, particularly a single mother who had been a domestic, who didn't have child care for her child, just the kind of struggles that she would encounter in terms of...
That's next time on The History of ...